Okay, I think we'll get started here. And yeah, I will just introduce myself and the series, and then allow Lauren to introduce herself. And so this is a bit of a webinar series that RIWI is doing here called The Art of Insights. This is the second one. We're hoping to do it monthly and have just, colleagues and experts who we have the pleasure of engaging with in our day-to-day work to come on and discuss some of the data findings that we have, as well as just discuss broader issues that are important to us and important to our work. And so, Lauren, thank you so much for coming. I'll introduce myself as the Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Lead here at RIWI. I work with the International Development Team, particularly on issues, involving authoritarian contexts, as well as human rights concerns, and generally, more broader governance-based issues. All of that is largely done through our, data and survey programming. We have a bunch of wonderful clients we've worked with in the past, and we're always, exploring ways that we can work with new folks and try to get some insights, as well as just great qualitative and quantitative data from hard to reach and easier to reach places. So, Lauren, would you mind introducing yourself and MIGS and what brings us the Digital Peace Project?
Sure, I'm so excited to be here today. My name is Lauren. I'm a project leader at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, which is based out of Concordia. We're a think tank that focuses on a variety of issues at the intersection of human rights and technology. In particular, we've done quite a few projects on hate speech, online harms, disinformation, digital authoritarianism, and things in that space. Starting in October, we got funding from the Department of Canadian Heritage to run a one-year project called the Digital Peace Project. The goal of this project was to kind of do a little bit of research and engage certain groups that are disproportionately targeted by online harms into some solution finding exercises. So we're organizing a series of roundtables, which I can talk about a little bit later. We are also very excitingly had partnered with RIWI to do the survey that we're going to be talking about today.
Fantastic. And so just kind of the layout of the session here is we'll go through a bit of a global landscape, look at this issue broadly, and then we'll dive into the Canadian specific data that we've collected over 2 waves of this survey. And then, have question periods towards the end. And as I mentioned, just feel free to put any questions in the chat as they come up, and we'll respond to those at the end. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. So in terms of the global landscape, it is unfortunately not the rosiest of landscapes when we're talking about online harms, and particularly who's often targeted by these harms and those perpetrating it. And so we've known for close to a decade now that the online space fundamentally reflects patriarchal and misogynistic offline spaces as well. Unfortunately, there's some key characteristics of the online space that really amplify and create whole new hosts of issues. And so just briefly, in 2016, The Guardian did a review of over 70 million comments across their articles. And they found that the comments that targeted most the authors with abuse, 8 of those were women, and the 2 men in the sample were Black men. And so really that was just the tip of the iceberg, and people realizing that people in various professions writing about a whole host of issues. Like this includes, sports writing, stuff that you might not think would be politicized or subject to vitriolic attacks, wasn't necessarily the case. And then fast forwarding really to 2023, going over a whole host of issues that was there. But what we're seeing now is really this factor into very key issues, like even being able to assess data about online harms and social harms in gender diverse spaces. So academics who are looking into LGBTQ studies are trying to conduct data collection on this, are subjected to manipulation and harassment. The study's authors and designers themselves are often targeted. And if they're trying to engage with study participants and share that type of the data collection tools through social media, let's say, their data is subjected to attacks, trolling attacks, and essentially creates undue burden and increase the resources that's needed to even just to collect data on these issues. More recently, we're starting to see that essentially the combination of misogynistic attacks and anti-democratic behavior, so how authoritarians and authoritarian contexts really start to utilize misogyny and gender, non-binary gender communities in order to advance political goals or to undermine democratic aims more broadly. And then just this last weekend in the United States, at the Conservative Action Conference, there was, essentially dehumanization and calls for what can kind of only be described as, the call for elimination of transgendered people from the conversation entirely. And that was viewed by a lot of people as specific calls to violence. So unfortunately, globally, we're seeing these trends hold. In 2020, the Economist Intelligence Unit conducted a pretty wide-scale survey and really found that 85% of women online reported witnessing or experiencing violence against other women. The personal attacks specifically were about 38% of the sample. And overall, there are some age characteristics around those who actually experience that. So we're seeing younger people more at risk of this. Lauren, would you like to share how this kind of reflects with your research that you've been conducting?
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of times you kind of hear this term online harms and you might think, what does that mean? What does that include? And it really includes a wide variety of actions that happen online, like cyber stalking, cyberbullying, non-consensual sharing of intimate images. There's deepfake porn, just harassment, the general direct threats of violence, and each of these have a really serious consequences on the ability for people to feel safe online, to feel comfortable sharing their opinions and participating in civic spaces. And as I think we can see with these statistics, there is a lot of that is targeting women. It's also targeting women leaders. And when we're looking at online hate against women, it can feel incredibly personal. It can often extend into the family life. We at MIGS ran a project in 2021 called the Canadian Women Leaders Digital Defense Initiative, where we interviewed a ton of women in politics and journalism, generally in the limelight, across the country, and we heard so many stories of being harassed, of being stalked. We heard one story of one former journalist whose children, there was threats of sexual violence against her children. So it can be incredibly personal and it can have a really serious impact on your ability to feel comfortable and your ability to enjoy being on the internet.
Absolutely. And also your ability to perform your profession or even, engage in specific professions that we're seeing. We'll get to the impacted professions just after I'll set a quick definition. Lauren reminded me how important definitions and statistics are, so we'll go through those very quickly here. The UN defines hate speech as any communication in speech, writing, or behavior that attacks or uses pejorative or discriminatory language with reference to a person or group on the basis of who they are. And so in other words, that's based on their religion, ethnicity, nationality, race, color, descent, gender, or other identity factor. Lauren, would you mind taking this slide?
Absolutely. So there, as we can see on the screen, there's several impacted professions. Like I mentioned earlier, it's a lot of people who are in the limelight, and that's, because the internet gives you direct access to people you wouldn't have had access to before. So there's a 125 country survey found that 81% of Black women journalists and 86% of Indigenous ones, 64% of white ones all said that they had experienced online violence. The rate of online violence experienced by lesbian and bisexual respondents were 88% and 85%, which is super high, respectively, compared to the 72% of heterosexual women. Only 22% of electoral management bodies are chaired by women, and digital aggression in the form of humiliation, devaluation of work, instigation to violence, intimidation, and threats further serve to discourage participation. So I think those are some really interesting statistics about the impacted professions. And when we're looking at how these attacks kind of relate to women, like we were talking about in the previous slide, they're kind of and their intent is to frame women as untrustworthy, unintelligent, too emotional, sometimes sexualized, and most disturbingly, we can see online that these attacks are carried out with malign intent and some level of coordination amongst the perpetrators. And when we're talking about the impacts of people in the public eye, again, it's really amplified due to the anonymity that the internet makes you feel like you have, that you can say things to people you wouldn't say in person because it seems really low stakes because you're anonymous. And also the impact that things online get shared more broadly if they're more mean, basically. Extreme content gets far more views, which kind of keeps you on the platform longer. So it's in the platform's best interest to do that. As this relates to women leaders, like we're seeing on this next slide, this can have a silencing effect that discourages their participation in public places, which obviously has the potential to jeopardize gender equality and representation within democratic institutions. There's some really great quotes on this next one. I really like the second one here because it emphasizes that misogyny doesn't exist in a vacuum, and it's often the symptom of something way larger wrong in the political environment. There's also another quote I wanted to add from a Canadian journalist who's been subjected to online hate. Erica Eiffel says, "I've received death threats, been the target of systematic campaigns of online abuse. They made me feel vulnerable, anxious, depressed, and confused. This hate was directed at me mainly due to my advocacy initiatives, as part of which I speak up for those who lack a voice. The one lesson I've learned through this is that silence and obedience does not keep you safe or invisible to attacks." Recently, there was a Canadian Journalist for Free Expression Gala, and one of the 3 women honored was given an award for calling out misogynistic online abuse and her courageous reporting. I've got actually one more additional quote I wanted to share with you. I don't know if anyone listening has watched the Harry and Meghan documentary on Netflix. There's a quote in it from Sophia Noble, who's the co-founder and faculty director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, which I think sums up the problem really nicely. And it's, if you can destroy people who are symbols, if you can destroy people who are symbols of social justice, then you can scare people to not want to be public.
Yeah, all extremely important points to point out. I'll just add to the Erica Eiffel quote. One of the other 3 journalists, Rachel Gilmore, who also received that Canadian Journalist for Free Expression Award, just this week, basically, she was laid off from Global News just simply due to financial constraints. And as she is then putting her personal email address out there to essentially have professional development opportunities, there have been individuals who have started taking out escort ads and directing that type of content to her personal email address. So the compounding nature of essentially these anonymous individuals, like you said, Lauren, is almost unbelievable in times, and it would be unless you actually start discussing and hearing these anecdotes and actually listening to these women and non-binary individuals who are experiencing this directly. So of course, the socio-political impacts of this are quite broad. It determines women, people of color, Two-Spirit, and LGBTQ+ from participating in electoral processes or even in the management of electoral processes. Discourages journalists from covering specific issues or topics or using social media to advance their career. And as Erica pointed out, even when you choose to avoid specific topics or to not comment on things, it actually isn't preventing that online abuse and online harms that come. So it's really not an effective strategy. You would assume it would have a deterring effect, but that's not actually the case because these individuals are personally targeted for really reasons of other individuals' own personal satisfaction or lack thereof. This creates extreme burdens on those who seek leadership roles in media and political organizations. Seen multiple female politicians, resign or shorten their tenure due to what they call is just a litany of online abuse. Catherine McKenna, who you worked with, Laura, on a variety of projects, who is the former Canadian environmental minister, has well experienced that. And then it impacts mental and physical health and can result in offline violence. And so, whereas our study doesn't look into that direct line between online and offline violence, there's a ton of data points out there that also show that those most subjected to it online also see offline consequences. So let's look into what some of the measurement challenges are then in even just understanding this issue. Just first and foremost, the collection of only binary gender data when we're looking at online harms and harassment. Not to single out Pew, they do fantastic work, and this is an old survey from 2017. But looking at this, you can see that women are experiencing more. But when you're not disaggregating beyond the binary gender spectrum, then you really are losing out on some of the more insightful analysis you can perform, which you'll see in our study. If you're performing social media analytics or looking at online spaces more broadly, women, non-binary, and people of color self-censor after online violence. About 30% of individuals in the study did that, or just log off entirely. So if you're looking at broader online conversations, online narratives, you're essentially missing a piece of that conversation simply because of the people who have essentially been abused out of that space. And then, as I mentioned, research authors are increasingly targeted for harassment and manipulation, deterring even establishing a body of evidence on these experiences. So how can we improve this? And so really, affected communities deserve intersectional research methods. These methods must deter manipulation and harassment of the researchers to the extent that's possible. And researchers should strive to use both qualitative and quantitative measures. As we will see, we've primarily looked at quantitative measures for this, but in research and case study findings, like in monetizing misogyny, the individual experiences are absolutely vital to both understand more broader extents of the issues, as well as identifying solutions really require some of that more qualitative insight. So briefly on RIWI's methods before we dive into the Canadian survey data. How do we collect online information? And so we use a web intercept technology that is anonymous and that strives to essentially capture the internet using population of any country that we're performing our study in. We can perform in any country in the world. And we start with hosting tens of thousands of rotating domains in that region of focus. And so that is either mistyped URLs to popular sites or dead links that you might be following off of social media or following off of a media article that no longer exists. And instead of a 404 error page, you will actually see our survey. And so what RIWI does is on the back end, we quickly confirm that you're from the region that we are wanting. And then we essentially eliminate any personally identifiable data collection and allow the individuals to opt in. So this is unincentivized, whereas often in panels, you're incentivized people participation. This is unincentivized and random in the URLs that people are coming across. People can choose to respond. There are some design and survey organization approaches that we've learned that can facilitate greater opt-in rates than others, let's say. One of those is including, in addition to binary gender data is non-binary options. So people want to actually feel like this study is, speaking or relevant to them. And then that data is basically translated into online dashboard, which you can see as that data comes in. So you don't need to wait till the entire study is done to start looking at some of the data. And what we find this works for in particularly is those types of marginalized voices, particularly the exact kind of study that we're looking at and the communities we're looking at here. And so these people who aren't necessarily your vocal social media participants, you're not the more habitual survey takers who may be incentivized for financial reasons to continually take surveys. At times we ask people, have you taken a survey in the past 12 months or so? And anywhere between 40 to 60% of our respondents usually say that they have not taken a survey in the last 12 months. And so what we're looking at is really getting at a population that might not be the typical source for public opinion. Anonymity provides its own assurances. There's a public policy or a privacy policy right off the bat when someone lands on our survey. So while they may not be expecting to encounter that, they can review what data is collected and be sure that they are able to perform the survey anonymously. This does work well for controlling for some interviewer effects. So there's been some really interesting studies done actually in Bangladeshi refugee camps with Rohingya refugees that looked at a Rohingya enumerator versus a Bangladeshi enumerator and how the responses from Rohingya changed based on the ethnicity of the enumerator, and saw that what you might describe as more honest answers to some of the challenges they faced were provided to the Rohingya enumerator, but not so much to the Bangladeshi enumerator. And then this data can be collected at any time of the day, and so we don't have to work within specific, confines, and we can track longitudinally a bit more as current events might change public opinion or might affect people's responses to various, social issues, political issues, or economic concerns. And the last thing I'll talk about before we jump into the data is what we have found internally via studies for what we view as one of the better methods to collect non-binary data. And so we ran 7 different experimental treatments on asking people to report gender identities. Starting with number 1 is just binary. And so what we're seeing is once you start providing people alternative options, that roughly between 5 to 9% of respondents either opt out of the first binary specific gender responses, or they just exit the survey entirely. So either they misgender and misidentify themselves for the sake of participating. So very important results that we found, and also why we are essentially advocating for disaggregated gender data. We also found that if in a 1 or 2 step process, so you can have the non-binary option and then have additional, trans men, trans women, that didn't necessarily generate different estimates. It does provide the individual with a bit more ability to self-identify further. However, we didn't see an increase in the number of individuals identifying as non-binary. And then we also provided an option for an open-ended question where people could essentially input their own gender identity. And unfortunately, there was some just lack of meaning, in the sense of either they were very repetitive and so could have been from a drop-down menu, or they were just non-relevant. So people were just inputting information erroneously or not paying attention to the specific question. So what we opted for this study was a non-binary option in addition to the male and female. And that brings us to the Digital Peace Project survey. And so, MIGS came to us, and I think it was later in the fall of last year, once that the funding had come through, and had basically, had already planned out the number of respondents they wanted. So across 2 waves, we were going to do 2,000 respondents each. It's geographically representative sample, comparable to census data, and each of the waves was completed in about 3 weeks. And so that was, each country has different kind of completion rates, and of course, depending on the number of complete respondents we're looking at. But with these ones, it happened actually quite quickly, and we spaced out the study by about a month or 2, just to see if there is any, specific time differences in, whether it's around Christmas, we'd see different people participating, but we actually didn't. Both of the samples were quite comparable. Okay, now I'm gonna just lob questions towards Lauren and get her reflection on this, and we'll go through some of these findings. And so, starting with kind of definitions. And so I think the percentage is less important to care about here, because we can, select multiple. So it doesn't necessarily translate into the number of people who support this definition, but just their own personal opinion across a couple different measures. But Lauren, what's your thoughts on, essentially personally offensive content being, slightly lower in terms of what people characterize as hate speech?
Yeah, I was really glad to see that less people wanted to click personally offensive content as part of the definition of hate speech. The other 3 options that we provided were a better match for the actual definition of hate speech, both the UN's and in Canada. So Again, it wasn't quite as low as I wanted. Like they were definitely more equal than I thought. And I think what we're seeing with that is we're seeing some of the tension between protecting the right to freedom of expression and protecting people from online hate and harassment. I think part of the beauty of the internet, whenever it was conceived, maybe, was that it connects you with people that have different ideas and can grow your worldview. But it also means that you're gonna come into contact with information that you might not like or don't agree with or might offend you, but doesn't necessarily meet the definition of hate speech in that it doesn't incite violence, it doesn't incite hatred, and it's not dehumanizing. So, for example, I think someone could say that women belong in the kitchen, and I would not enjoy reading that, and I might find it personally offensive, and I might even give it a thumbs down, but it doesn't incite hatred or violence, and it isn't in and of itself dehumanizing. So overall, I'm happy to see that it's lower because it does match the proper definition that we are using for hate speech.
Okay, yeah, and potentially a point of future programming for just even education around the definition and yeah, basically yeah, giving more of an educational approach to these definitions might be beneficial in the Canadian context.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So yeah, this is basically, we asked people what common reasons they might be. You can select up to 3 that people actually experience this. And I just wanted to get your opinion, Lauren, on how this tracks with kind of other research we're seeing around how people selected particularly identity reasons why people might be targets of hate speech.
Yeah, I thought this question turned out really great. When we were designing the project, we kind of wanted to focus on 3 buckets or grounds for discrimination that we thought were most common. And what we decided to design the roundtables that we're hosting on was women, someone who identifies as 2S LGBTQI+, race and ethnicity as a grounds, being a member of an Indigenous, Métis, or First Nations community, and religious identity. And so as we can see, kind of the top ones that people selected really also line up with our educated guess. They also do match other research on groups that are disproportionately targeted by hate speech. I've got just a couple examples here. I think there was a 2-week period in May 2021 where the Anti-Defamation League saw 17,000 tweets that centered on the theme Hitler was right. And I don't think that anyone has to spend a super long time on Twitter before you see online hate in the comments that focuses on gender identity, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, or religion. It's pretty prevalent. Also in 2021, Stats Canada issued a report on police reported hate crimes. So obviously that's far narrower because people have to report them to the police, but they found that hate crimes targeting Black and Jewish populations remained the most common types of hate crimes, representing 18 and 16% of all police reported hate crimes, respectively. And hate crimes targeting sexual orientation accounted for 14% of all hate crimes. Last, there was a multi-year analysis that shows victims of police-reported hate crimes that targeted sexual orientation in the Indigenous population tend to be the youngest among hate crime victims, and they unfortunately sustain the highest rate of injury.
Right, so it looks like essentially people's online experience both mirrors the offline experience in how it's reported to police, but that also people are essentially seeing the specific targets as the other data bears that out. So they are, yeah, unfortunately witnessing an accurate representation of why people are targeted. And so, yeah, we have essentially agree or disagree on a 5-point scale for this question. And what I want to do is, yeah, just show kind of 2 slides here, 3 on the same question, but we'll start with 2 to really show how disaggregated data has some power to really dive deeper down into how we design online spaces and essentially what people's perspective of freedom of speech or just, comfort in all opinions being shared. And so just, yeah, off the bat, you'll see, the vast majority, almost 75% of folks will agree or strongly agree that the internet should be a place where everyone can feel comfortable sharing their opinions. And then when we start disaggregating that further, we really start to see that necessarily that's not the case, and that there's a high percentage of non-binary folks strongly disagreeing with this. And so, yeah, Lauren, what do you think these results kind of tell us about people's online experiences and how it differs across genders?
Yeah, I think the first slide where it's kind of just generic didn't surprise me at all. If I were to think of just asking random people on the street if they felt like people should feel safe online, a majority of people I think would say, yes, I agree with that. And that would kind of indicate a high level of confidence and appreciation for freedom of speech online and a general desire for platforms to be encouraging spaces. But I think when we look at the disaggregated data, it does definitely get interesting. And I think the disparities we're seeing between, like the non-binary, particularly the male respondents, kind of corresponds with how comfortable these groups are at being online kind of at the moment. I think what the non-binary folks here are saying is like, hey, when people feel that comfortable sharing their opinions online, they're a little too comfortable discriminating against me and people like me and spreading hate, etc. So I think that's coming from a lived experience of being the target of someone else's freedom of expression online.
Yeah, yeah, really well said. And I think one recent example of this, which was post Twitter acquisition by Elon Musk, is Twitter actually had, prior to that, had a great policy around dead naming transgendered folks, and you could actually be kicked off the platform if you essentially used the name that transgendered folks no longer referred to themselves as. That policy has been rescinded now, I believe. And so what we're seeing is an online space where, yeah, people feeling comfortable has a direct correlation with the dehumanizing effect that has on other folks. And this is the same question, but by 4 ethnic categories that we collected. We collected more, but I chose to isolate it to these 4 for now. And yeah, I think we're seeing some similar trends. Wouldn't you say, Lauren?
Yeah, definitely similar kind of forces at work here. I think you're gonna have a different perspective on how comfortable people should be sharing their opinions online if those opinions have generally proven to hurt you. And I think, again, the Stats Canada data that I shared earlier kind of points to race and ethnicity being a huge identity point that is unfortunately the target of so much of the hate we're seeing online. So this doesn't necessarily surprise me.
Okay. Great, so on to the next question here. And that question is, do you agree or disagree? I feel, sorry, it's blocked by my top screen here. Lauren, you want to read out what the question is?
Yeah, I feel comfortable expressing my opinions online without fear of being attacked. Yeah, so these results made a lot of sense to me. It's not surprising that men have a more optimistic view of sharing opinions online and feeling safe doing so, because I think the large proportion of hate we see online is perpetrated by male users. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the victims that we're seeing are women or members of the LGBTQI plus community. So if you aren't going to feel comfortable expressing yourself online if you have a lived experience dealing with hate, and I think that's kind of evident there. The online space doesn't exist, again, in a vacuum, and what we see on it is often just an amplified version of what we see offline. So I think these stats are a good indication of how non-binary folk and women feel expressing themselves in public places and participating in civic spaces.
Yeah, really well said. Yeah, I think why just kind of a writ large call for freedom of expression really is essentially only a portion of the conversation, and how, those who are often making that call to, like, yeah, free expression should trump all other considerations when we're looking at moderation or online hate speech. Yeah, those calls are likely coming from those folks who directly aren't targets of that of those negative opinions online. And so we have here in the past 12 months, have you witnessed or experienced hate speech online? So this just talks about the lived experience of this. And yeah, I'm pretty sure it tracks with kind of what you're saying, Lauren, in terms of, those non-binary and women in particular have much higher experiences. And, most from several times a month when we're seeing on the non-binary side, then to several times or once or twice on the women's side. And so, just another reason why disaggregating the data when we're looking at this is extremely necessary. It's not a choice really anymore if we're looking at online harms or offline harms where we need to collect this. Next is the same question, but done by essentially the ethnicity options that we provided, and I aggregated the less than one time or more than one time into this, and so Lauren, you know, looking at this and seeing that essentially the white respondents had never experienced it, 6% higher than the next category, 6 or 5% more than the next category. What does this kind of like say us about how platform design, or maybe even those designing these platforms, or participating or engaging in the development of these at various social media companies, how that might impact where they're directing resources to, essentially, controlling for these types of issues online.
Yeah, I definitely think it definitely has some points to the platforms and the algorithms they use to promote content and also to content moderate. So I think if you have, a group of all white males on a table, you're maybe not building a platform, or you're not writing algorithms that are going to make Indigenous or Hispanic or Black users feel safe and feel protected online. And those algorithms they're not non-biased. They're definitely built with bias in them. And I think that's what we're seeing with these statistics.
Yeah, absolutely agree on that front. Okay, so next question is around, do you think content moderation? So the next slides until the end are going to be getting into how we should moderate these spaces then, which I think is an extremely important conversation. We've identified the drivers of the problems and the lived experiences of these problems. And so, I think, just looking at these, what kind of stands out to me is that it might be counterintuitive, let's say, in terms of who is calling for increased moderation. And so just off the top, no majority across any ethnic group is calling for increased moderation. So really we're seeing either remain the same or decreasing it. And similar to the question of the lived experience amongst Arab and Black respondents, they're actually some of the higher calls for decreasing moderation a lot. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, Lauren.
Yeah, I think I was a little surprised by these findings the first time I saw it. I think at first glance, you'd think that people who frequently experience online hate, online harms might be pro increased content moderation. And their rejection of that could definitely be from maybe being jaded on the effectiveness of content moderation or the design and the algorithms that go into it. But I think it's largely due to kind of the over moderation of these groups. They receive, large amounts of hate online, but also when they're talking about their own identity or causes they support and care about, their content is repeatedly flagged by the notice and takedown method, in which like an AI or an algorithm flags content based on keywords. And again, those algorithms are biased. They might, things like Black Lives Matter or anything to do with being Muslim has been proven to be flagged for takedown far more, and that over moderation impacts your ability to feel safe expressing yourself online. Again, the AI kind of only picks up on keywords. They might not understand the context or the nuance of those conversations, leading to their being kind of misconstrued or triggering the involvement of law enforcement.
Yeah, absolutely, really well said. The only thing I'll add to that is also we see the weaponization of content moderation essentially through users reporting information that they may disagree with them. So similar to you have trolling of research into these harms, you'll have people essentially trolling by mass piling on reporting of, a marginalized community expressing their either experience or their disgust with the current reality that they're facing, and then are having their accounts at least temporarily frozen because of a mass reporting or having content taken down. And so it's very, I think, key to look at these findings and to realize that just increased moderation writ large is not going to solve the problem. And we really need to start thinking much more intelligently, and also how these moderation tools are used in practice, like you said. And so we just have 4 more slides here from the survey results. they're not disaggregated because the results were within a couple percentage points of another, and this is talking around who should be responsible for moderation. So I've just kept them in the general respondents category, but what it really does show us is what specific bodies people feel that they trust or lack thereof in terms of this. So Lauren, this is social media platforms performing content moderation. You know, what do you think they've handled in the past? I think we've already just discussed this in the last one, but yeah, what do you think people's responses to not really entire or actually, you know, a bit higher than our other responses in trusting social media companies to perform this moderation?
Yeah, I was maybe a little bit surprised about given the previous slides that they got 34% for entirely in charge. But I think the high percentage of the somewhat response was maybe people not understanding how social media platforms do it, and then they're like, I'm not sure, like it might be okay, I don't know. I think it's a lack of confidence or maybe an uneasiness or a general I don't understand how it works about the notice and takedown method. I think, you know, the social media platforms are in there and they're the ones designing the algorithms, but on the flip side, like, do you want social media companies to be the providers and enforcers of your rights? And maybe in some places where your government, your federal government is more strict, you might want that. It might actually give you more freedoms or give you more protections, like human rights defenders. But in some places, it might be more restrictive. And so I think, yeah, it's definitely an interesting one given what we kind of previously saw.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, federal government, this is how involved this should the federal government be. So we do see a higher percentage increase and not at all, going from 22% to 25%. Sorry, I am going the wrong direction here. So yeah, this is the social media platforms, and then now this is federal government. So we're going from 25 to 22, but some oversight people are starting to see as valuable. Sorry, that's third party. Let's go back one more here too. This is government. So yeah, there's still similar higher percentages for somewhat, but you can see that the politicization of content moderation really shows that people are trusting the federal government way less to perform these services.
Yeah.
What are some of your takeaways you think that you can provide for this, you know, particularly if the federal government as a funder of this study? What are some of the kind of feedback you might provide in final analysis of this?
Yeah, this didn't surprise me at all. I think generally there's a couple different conferences I've been at where people are a little bit more hesitant to have federal government involved in kind of policing or designing the internet in any way. And again, I think that the high percentage of somewhat is definitely not surprising given the variety of opinions post the handling of COVID. Tons of people maybe weren't that happy or didn't feel that confident with the way the federal government shared information online. Was it accessible? Was it easy to understand? Do they know really enough about how the internet works to be in charge of moderating it or developing legislation? And on the other side, I think there's also a lot of people who felt like it was too much from the federal government, that there's too many restrictions. And so, yeah, I'm not at all surprised that there's such a high somewhat category. I think as you know, the federal government is working on the C11 bill, I think it'd be really interesting to note a couple of these hesitations and a couple of what people want. I think kind of going back to the previous slide a little bit, the previous discussion about the content moderation and assuming that we want, assuming that groups that are targeted want content moderation, I think is largely the assumption, but there's tons of groups who feel like it'll restrict their rights. And I think that's what you're seeing with the federal government responses.
Yeah, really, really good point on that front. And, you know, as we kind of said in the beginning, and we'll finalize at the end here, is that more qualitative discussions with focus groups, so you can both explain how content moderation might work from you know, third party or a social media platform is extremely valuable to have. And so, yeah, the final question on content moderation here is on the third-party oversight bodies. And we're seeing the highest support for some oversight. And so I really think that this, you know, has some value in terms of maybe consortiums or coalitions of folks who have multiple, you know, both community-informed users or participants and are kind of a hands-off from the government and from the social media platforms themselves, may be one of the easier kind of content moderation vehicles that could be accepted kind of by the general public. Great. Okay, so yeah, we have just final informed kind of solutions for data collection here. And so these are just, based on what we've kind of looked at, as well as some of the reporting and research that Lauren has mentioned. So one is that gender disinformation should be treated as an early warning system for broader socio-political issues. As the quote from Chenoweth and Marx said, authoritarianism and misogyny are complementary. And then so once we start seeing this, both in the online or offline space, we have to start kind of analyzing kind of slightly deeper into what type of forces, political or otherwise, might be at play. I think we've demonstrated that gender disaggregated data is pretty essential here to understanding, the compounding factors of online hate speech harassment and those communities most effective, as well as just disaggregated, quantitative findings can guide, focus group discussion amongst, chatting with Black Canadians or with Muslim Canadians about, hey, why is it that maybe moderation has harmed your community in the past, and how you don't see that as necessarily the solution going forward.
Mhm.
Yeah, and then, this is kind of a bit more higher level and a bit more of kind of what we can do kind of going forward. And this is kind of in how we design these products. And so one is if we can co-design moderation policies and design choices with these communities specifically. So once you've identified it, you can, both expose them to product features, whether that's through experiments like randomized controlled trials, and have, various, treatment groups who can actually respond, go through what this moderation policy is, and then identify some of those adverse effects. So if you're testing this out at scale, maybe you start seeing, the manipulation of reporting of specific posts, not because of someone disagrees with it, but because they can see that as a way of effectively controlling other people's speech. And this comes from the Monetizing Misogyny report, and we'll just finish with it, that really globally minded legislative frameworks, as we're seeing in those responses to who should be responsible, is we kind of need broader third-party options. We can't rely on individual federal governments for a variety of reasons to really be the main driving force. One reason is just that they don't have a lot of political support in doing that, and there's partisanship that can really muddy that process. And yeah, similar to how we saw the GDPR or the Digital Services Act come from the EU, there are trickle-down effects for when we pass legislation that has broad encompassing issues for whether it's online tracking, data collection, or just digital, or basically using of the digital space. It's important to think a bit more transnational in that regard. Fantastic. So yeah, Lauren and I would love to hear your questions. I see there's some in the chat here that I'll start with. And one is around, did anything interesting come out of the demographics of the study, like age or education or socioeconomics? And I can take this, Lauren, or you can take that. It's up to you.
That's all you got it.
Cool. So I've spent a bit more time in the weeds of this data a bit. And so definitely, as we showed, demographics around race and gender, absolutely. Education, we didn't actually collect educational statistics on this survey. It's something we do quite often, both education, financial income, things along those sides. But age, we did not see really as much of a defining correlation between experience or moderation policies. So like the Economist Intelligence Unit found out in that first slide that Gen Z and millennials were kind of more used to experiencing and witnessing it online. We actually didn't see that as much with this study, and the pessimistic side of me wants to say that it's because the landscape has changed in the 3 years since that study was done. And I am not of the baby boomer generation, but in chatting with both parents and other folks who are there, it seems like the hostility, animosity, and just the vitriol that exists in those spaces now, whether it's on Facebook groups or whether it's even on community pages, seems to have rapidly increased, since COVID. And so unfortunately, yeah, we're seeing now, rather than a decrease in some age demographics, we're actually seeing an increase amongst others. Another question here is, are there opportunities you see to change the landscape of incentives or interests of social media and online actors to improve online behaviors? So as we mentioned, platforms are incentivized to promote extreme content, and it seems, if anything, things are going the other way, as in the recent Twitter changes. So yeah, Lauren, any optimism that you can provide in how we incentivize this engagement?
Totally. I think, as Catherine pointed out, it's really hard to incentivize social media platforms to change that behavior. Like they make a profit off of there being online hate or really viral extreme content on their platform. That's how you get advertising revenue. That's how you get people to stay on your platform longer. And so I think in my opinion, that is where the work of the federal government or the work of, international coalitions is to find a way to disincentivize tech companies. I know, capitalism, but I think that's really where the key role for large governments and coalitions is to find a way to disincentivize platforms from making that money. I would also recommend that the federal government advocate for an increase of transparency. I think, if I go on Twitter and I don't know how the algorithm works, I think, wow, there is a lot of really negative people on here. And I think if there was a bit more transparency to be like, well, you're seeing that content because it sells, and it's also probably being amplified by a ton of bots. It's inauthentic behavior. I think people would maybe understand how the internet works a little bit different. So transparency in algorithms, definitely something to advocate for, and disincentivizing platforms from making a profit off of hate.
Yeah, absolutely crucial. In terms of Twitter, as Catherine mentioned it, there is, or the community notes, so it was formerly Birdwatch, I think, where users can essentially label content as misleading or incorrect, and then people can upvote or downvote that. That's one way to incentivize at least more critical analysis, let's say, of the type of content. It's humorous to see even content Elon Musk has posted now to get the community notes down, people being like, actually, this is not true. And so even if the owner can't control the true information that is labeling on there, then maybe that's a good first step. But like you said, the incentivization around the economic structures of these platforms almost has a direct line to needing to promote polarizing content, and whether that's through advertising or just increased engagement. The last thing I'll say on that is I was speaking with a product designer in San Francisco a few weeks ago, formerly for Facebook, for Meta, and I think it reflects on how the platforms also just need to build features or at least incorporate features they already have into the algorithmic promotion. So he was trying to decrease content in his own feed and clicking on do not show me more, do not show me more, wherein that was just returning more of that same content. He went to the product designer who was responsible for that feature, and he told them that essentially that data point was never coded to essentially be incorporated by the promotion algorithm. So what he was actually doing was spending more time on the content he didn't want to see, and that was optimized for time spent on the type of content. So in trying to use Facebook's very clear, yes, show me less of this, you would theoretically think that that would actually, have a result in showing it less. It's actually doing the inverse effect, which is just a little mind-blowing and depressing, but hey, that's the reality. Last question here. So we just have 4 minutes. So wondering about your ideas on how the ideal moderator would look like, if it's not the government or the actual platforms. It definitely looks like a challenging role. But yeah, what are your thoughts, Lauren?
Yeah, that is a tough question. It's way easier to tear things apart than to put them back together. But I think that kind of a better blend is probably what's required. I think the Facebook Oversight Board, despite its flaws, is a really interesting experiment into kind of what the third party would look like. I definitely think there's definitely some improvements that tech platforms need to do. It's their product. They can content moderate it a little bit better. There's obviously that really huge failing of the Rohingya. If you've got, AI moderating and you've got no human reviewers that speak the local language, they're not going to be able to flag that content as inciting violence, which the content in Myanmar definitely did. So I think and I think the data also shows that people really want the human reviewer to have a more significant role in content moderation than it does, which is obviously a manpower problem. But yeah, I would definitely say that. And I would definitely say I think we need to explore sort of the Facebook oversight model a little bit more. It might not work, but it is better than what we got going.
Yeah, really well said. And as you mentioned that, I realized I think we glanced over this last finding, which was, who should be responsible for moderating, whether it's a trained human reviewer, software AI, or if the viewer should filter. And you can see that, a small minority of folks really want software or artificial intelligence to be the main governor of content moderation. It needs to be trained human reviewer. And then you get into unfortunate discussions around the harms that come from reviewing this type of content on a regular basis, and how it's often outsourced to marginalized communities themselves to be responsible for it, or just don't have the language capabilities, like you said, in order for trained users to actually filter. Lauren, thank you so much. I think this was a really great discussion, and I'm really excited to see the kind of final reporting that comes out of both this study, but then also all of the focus groups that you have, because I think really that is that qualitative piece that will help kind of identify some solutions going forward. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. And so, feel free, anyone, to reach out via email here. We'll be sending out a recording of this after to anyone who's registered. And so that's it for today. And there'll be another webinar in a month. If you're interested in that, keep an eye out for your email. All right. Thank you, everyone.